those of you who don't know me, my name's Stephen Buckley. For the last 30 years I've been a multimedia developer working in film, video and programming. So I've lived through most of the Star Wars era actually creating some of this content. And you might have seen some of my work if you ever went onto the FIFA Streets website or Direct Line, car insurance, the BBC. Most of the technology you use on an aircraft when you watch a video, and also if you ever used a YouTube box, I did the experimental work for the electronic programming guide for that. But also, I've been a member of the Family Federation for, gosh, how long can I care to remember actually? Almost 48 years. So, I met True Parents in 1976 and was part of the 360,000 couple blessing almost 30 years ago. So, when we follow the Star Wars saga of 9 films, the first, we started in the middle. The first one was released in 1967, and you know it was entitled A New Hope, but we didn't know the backstory until we got to the first 3, and the first 3 chart 2 things. They chart the fall of Anakin Skywalker to become Darth Vader. And we'll come to this a little bit later, but how is it that such an innocent child becomes an object of evil? But it's in the middle. We saw A New Hope. At the end of the 3rd film, Padme gives birth to twins, Luke and Leia. So where we come into the story in the 70s is these 2 twins have been hidden away from Darth Vader, and suddenly Luke, who is an orphan, comes face to face with a message that introduces him to Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi Knight. And so what we see is that Luke's journey to become a hero and a Jedi Knight runs through the 3 films: A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. And what happens you get 2 types of people in this journey. You have the celibate Jedi Knight who sacrifices himself, and then you have the parents who sacrifice themselves for the sake of the children. And so Luke is deeply shocked to find out that this evil figure, Darth Vader, is actually his father. This comes as an incredible shock to him. That how if I'm supposed to be a person of goodness, how can I come from this evil person? So, but in Return of the Jedi, Darth Vader redeems himself, having become a person of evil. He gives up his life protecting his son, so that actually the Emperor Palpatine is killed at the end of episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and that's where the middle series of the films ended in the 1980s. So then we move on to the later series of films, The Force Awakens, Episode 7. Now what I like about this series of films is that they've got such strong female leads. You know, Rey, who is the central character, is a very strong young woman, a very confident young woman. But again, she doesn't know who her parents were. She's been abandoned by her parents and left to scavenge for herself on this planet. So the Force begins to awaken again, and we're reintroduced to Han Solo and Princess Leia, who in the meantime have been married. But the evil character in the film, one of the evil characters in the film is Kylo Ren, who is responsible for the Knights of Ren. We find out later in the story that he's the son of Han Solo and Princess Leia. So the question becomes, how does somebody born of a lineage of goodness, of two heroes from further back in the story, end up being a villain? Particularly when actually the person to guide him in the Force was his uncle, Luke Skywalker. How does he become a person of evil? And we're going to investigate that a little bit later, going back to the quote from the principle I mentioned earlier on. So the story proceeds. Han Solo actually sacrifices himself, thinking that he can actually sacrifices himself as a parent, thinking he can redeem Ben, but he's not successful. So we move on into the last Jedi, and again the hero in this particular there's some give and take going on between Rey and Kylo Ren, and they find that somehow they're linked. They don't quite in this film they don't quite understand how, but they're linked together, and their destinies are linked together, much like Luke and Leia were in the original series. But in this film, it is Luke Skywalker that, as the hero, gives up his life in order to allow the rebellion to escape. So we move into the final film, The Rise of Skywalker, and we find out that Rey and Ben are actually a dyad in the Force. They're actually a form of twins. They're like a masculine and feminine entity within the Force itself. And Leia sacrifices herself to try and reach Ben during the film. So again, we see parental sacrifice, trying to save the child. But Rey finds out that she is the Emperor Palpatine's granddaughter. That Palpatine has tried to resurrect himself and clone himself, and one of the failed clones is actually Rey's father. And because he has no Jedi powers, Palpatine considered him worthless. So, in the climax of the film, Rey and Ben, who has redeemed himself, there's a relationship going on. It's unclear whether there's a love relationship between Rey and Ben, or whether he simply sees her as his sister, as his counterpart in the film. I think it's the latter. But essentially, in a battle with Palpatine, both of them die, or Ben is thrown into a pit. Rey is dying, and he comes back and resurrects her. He gives the last of his life energy from the Force in order to keep her alive. So the series closes with Rey returning to Tatooine and taking the name of Skywalker. So we're back where we started with Luke, in the middle of the desert. Now, actually, I find that terrifically unsatisfying. What's wrong with the idea behind the Force? Where does it stem from? Can anybody tell me? What's wrong with it? It stems from classical dualism. It has no concept of a personal God. There's no heart there. It's only impersonal forces operating within the universe. And one of the things that Jesus brings when he comes is he brings the concept of God as our Father. That he brings the concept in of a loving God who is compassionate and merciful towards his people, towards his children. And this is the first time in history that the concept of there being a parent-child relationship between God and ourselves is actually introduced into the world. But where was the feminine heart of God in Jesus' time? If it ever surfaced, it never came to full fruition. And as Christianity passes through Greek and Roman mythology, we start to get an overlay, a pagan overlay on Christianity and the original Christian teachings. And this is classical Greek thought. The idea of odd and even, left and right, male and female, light and darkness, good and bad. And the idea within Star Wars is that these things will always exist. So good and evil, light and darkness are in constant battle with one another. And this was one of the ideas behind within Gnosticism and within many, many forms of classical dualism. But it still exists. It still exists in our world, and it came into medieval Christianity. You know, what's wrong with this? Anybody tell me?
That
It means that good and bad will exist forever.
Yeah. Well, what's worse is the female is stuck on the bad side.
All right, yeah.
That's what's worse. This idea is that females are inherently evil. How is that right within the concept of the principle? Not even close. Yeah, even our English word for left, sinister, comes from the Latin sinister. You have to understand how history has shaped our perceptions of the modern world. You have to understand how much you've been preconditioned not to think about the world from God's point of view. You know, when we read Philippians, he talks about being in a wicked generation. We've seen the world that has been built from the fall has come full flower into our society, where we no longer even have a sense of what's right and wrong. So, all of these ideas came into Christianity. So Christianity was polluted by pagan ideas, and it forms Paul's writings were altered to give a misogynistic slant. How do you equate the man who wrote 1 Corinthians 13, who says that when you know the power, if I speak with the tongue of men and angels, but have nothing, but do not have love, I am nothing. And Paul also says that our prophecy is imperfect and our knowledge is imperfect, and when the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. So, who says the Holy Spirit can't do this? Who says that women can't preach? Who says that the feminine heart of God cannot talk to you from a pulpit? So what does, if Adam and Eve had not fallen, what does a spirit-led, balanced relationship between husband and wife look like? I can't tell you that. The only person that can decide that is you within your own relationship between husband and wife. How does this child become Darth Vader? How does this innocent child, Anakin Skywalker, become Darth Vader? And it's the spirit of the age. We talked about conscience. We have become a society that has no concept of God within it. We're dominated by, you know, Star Wars is a wonderful set of films, but do you ever question the underlying assumptions? And it's there in everything you watch in television. Everything you see is manipulated. Nothing is true. So if you're influenced by the spirit of the age, your personal view of truth becomes slanted. You actually can't see things straight. You know, we say that immature nature number one, a failure to see from God's viewpoint. And I call it immature nature rather than fallen nature because that's exactly what it is. The first human ancestors, when they fell, were children. They were nothing more than children. And so, in their immaturity, they didn't understand the deep heart of Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. They didn't understand that God was their parent. And so they acted out of ignorance. And so, when we hear Father Moon or Mother Moon talk about conscience, they're talking about the original mind, which is deeper than conscience. It understands the truth of the universe. It understands the language of the heart. It understands the language of love. And when you look at your grandchildren, you understand that language intuitively, automatically. This is, on the surface, this looks like quite a romantic image. And I did have a quote in there from C.S. Lewis, from the Screwtape Letters. How many people have actually read it as a book? Should be recommended reading. Because Lewis talks about how evil works to influence our society and our hearts and our minds. And so what he says is that through working through a small circle of artists, dressmakers, actresses and advertisers, they determine a fashionable type. And it's all fake. Look at how pinched the waist is on the woman. Look how androgynous. It's a fake image. And when Lewis wrote this in the 1940s, he was talking about the 1930s. How much worse is it? You know, the way things are depicted in our society now is completely fake. So the end point of this sort of thinking is toxic masculinity and toxic femininity within our society. And this is what your children are watching on TikTok. So when we think about, when we go back to the reading, where when we think about what True Mother is trying to achieve, she's trying to bring a very different feminine heart of God into our society. In that, Bogdan talked about creating a garden, and the stage by stage love, care and attention that goes into creating a garden. When we go from thinking about God as the architect, as the creator, as a masculine being, if the thing's rubbish, you can just screw it and throw it away. But when we think about Heavenly Mother as creating, giving birth to the universe, as bringing forth Adam and Eve as the first two human children. Mothers, can you screw your children up and throw them away? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. You brought it to fruition over the space of 10 lunar months. You love that child with absolute heart. Why is it so difficult for human beings to see that that's exactly the way God feels about all of us? Each and every child, each and every person. Why is it so hard for us to see that? At the moment of every single person sat in this room, at the moment of your conception, something beautiful, something deep, something incredible was injected into you. It's called the original image. Our physical bodies come from our parents. Certain aspects and elements of our spiritual bodies come from the love relationship between our parents. But at the time, actually even before your conception, God thinks about it and says, okay, this one is going to be called Tom, and he's going to be musical, and he's going to have these abilities, and he's going to do this and that. And I can't wait to see what he does with those abilities. So when we look at our grandchildren as grandparents, we see all this potential within our grandchildren. And God looks at each and every person like that. He gives each and every one of us a set of abilities and a set of capabilities. And actually, he's incredibly excited to see what you're going to do with that. The Stoics of ancient Greece had a definition of happiness. And it was this, that the person found the person found a unique use for their unique set of abilities to serve the community, the polis, the state. And so actually every one of us is given a part to play within building the kingdom of heaven. Every single person has a place to play within the kingdom of heaven on earth. And that means that there's an exciting and adventurous life in front of you. It doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter where you are. If you're still young at heart, if you're still relating to God as a child, there's still an incredibly adventurous life waiting for you. So go out, connect to God's heart, and create an adventurous life that God is excited to see. Close with a short prayer.